Imagine you are waiting in line at a coffee shop. The person in front of you is talking loudly on the phone. They ignore the cashier, hold up the line, and walk away without saying thank you. Within seconds, your mind has built a complete profile. They are rude, self-centered, probably the kind of person who treats everyone badly. Now imagine learning the rest of the story. Their father has just been taken to the hospital. The person on the phone is a doctor. They barely heard the cashier because they were trying to understand whether they needed to leave immediately. Their behavior has not changed, but your explanation has. And that gap between the behavior you see and the situation you cannot see is where one of the most powerful cognitive biases lives. It is called the fundamental attribution error. We tend to explain other people's behavior by looking at who they are. But we explain our own behavior by looking at what happened to us. When someone else is late, they are irresponsible. When we are late, traffic was terrible. When someone else speaks sharply, they are unpleasant. When we speak sharply, we are exhausted. When someone else makes a mistake, it reveals their character. When we make the same mistake, it was an unusual situation. This bias does not simply make us wrong about strangers. It changes how we manage employees, judge partners, punish children, interpret politics, and remember conflict. And the most dangerous part is that our explanations rarely feel like guesses. They feel like observations. The human mind dislikes unexplained behavior. When someone does something, your brain immediately asks, why? But there are two broad types of answer. The first is a dispositional explanation. They acted that way because of who they are. They are lazy, arrogant, generous, intelligent, dishonest, or impatient. The second is a situational explanation. They acted that way because of the circumstances surrounding them. They were under pressure, following instructions, missing information, afraid of punishment, or responding to an incentive. Both explanations can be valid. People have personalities, values, and habits. Situations also exert enormous influence. The bias appears when we give too much weight to character and too little weight to context, especially when judging someone else. Think of the mind as a detective who wants to close the case quickly. Character is a convenient suspect. It is simple. It is visible. And once the detective writes bad person on the file, there is no need to investigate the environment. But simple explanations are not always accurate explanations. Why do we make this mistake so easily? One reason is attention. When you watch someone behave, the person is visually and mentally prominent. You see their face, you hear their words, you notice their movements, but you may not see the forces acting on them. You cannot see the deadline, the financial pressure, the instruction from their manager, the argument they had 10 minutes earlier, the information they were never given. The person is standing in a spotlight. The situation is hidden backstage. And the mind often assumes that the most visible part of an event is also its most important cause. Imagine watching an actor crying on a stage. If you forgot that there was a script, a director, and an entire production surrounding the actor, you might conclude that the actor was genuinely devastated. In everyday life, we often see the actor, but forget the stage. A classic experiment demonstrated how difficult it can be to correct for situational pressure. Participants read essays that either supported or criticized Fidel Castro. Some were told that the writers had freely chosen their position. Others were explicitly told that the writers had been assigned which side to argue. You might expect participants to ignore the essay when the writer had no choice. After all, an assigned argument tells you very little about what the writer truly believes. But participants still tended to infer that writers of pro-Castro essays held more favorable attitudes toward Castro, even when they knew the position had been assigned. They noticed the constraint. They simply did not reduce their personality judgment enough. This reveals an important distinction. The bias does not always mean that we completely ignore the situation. Sometimes we recognize it intellectually, but fail to give it enough weight. You may know that a customer service employee must follow a restrictive policy, but you still walk away thinking she was deliberately unhelpful. You may know that a colleague was instructed to challenge your proposal, but part of you still concludes, he has always had something against me. Knowing that a situation exists is not the same as correctly estimating its power. There is another asymmetry at work. When you observe someone else, your attention is directed toward that person. When you act, your attention is often directed toward the environment. You see the traffic. You feel the time pressure. You remember the missing instructions. You know what you intended to do. Other people cannot see most of that. They see the final behavior. This creates two different movies. In the movie you watch about yourself, you are surrounded by context. In the movie other people watch, you are the context. Suppose you interrupt someone during a meeting. Inside your movie, you were worried that the conversation was moving in the wrong direction. You had tried to speak twice. The meeting was almost over. Inside their movie, you are simply someone who interrupts. Your mind has access to your intentions. Their mind has access to your behavior. This is why conflicts often produce two completely believable stories. One person says, I was reacting to the situation. The other says, no. You showed me who you really are. A single attribution can become a long-term label. Imagine an employee misses one deadline. Their manager concludes they are unreliable. Once that label exists, future information gets filtered through it. When the employee finishes something early, it is an exception. When they ask a question, they lack initiative. When they work independently, they are not communicating. When they miss another deadline, the original judgment feels confirmed. The label is no longer just describing behavior, it is organizing perception. This creates what we can call the labeling loop. Behavior leads to character judgment, which leads to selective attention, which leads to stronger character judgment. The same loop appears in relationships. A partner forgets to buy something. They do not care. A friend takes hours to reply. They only contact me when they need something. A child refuses to complete a task. They are lazy. Once the trait has been assigned, we stop asking what conditions produced the behavior. And that matters because character labels often suggest punishment, while situational explanations suggest problem solving. If an employee is lazy, you pressure them. If the workflow is unclear, you redesign it. If a child is defiant, you discipline them. If the instruction is overwhelming, you break it into smaller steps. The explanation determines the intervention. A wrong explanation can produce a perfectly logical but completely ineffective response. The bias becomes especially powerful when behavior has a moral dimension. We do not merely think they made a poor decision. We think they are the kind of person who makes poor decisions. This feels useful because it gives us a sense of predictability. If behavior comes from stable character, then the world is easier to understand. Good people do good things. Bad people do bad things. Responsible people succeed. Irresponsible people fail. But real behavior is more unstable than this model suggests. A patient person can become impatient under sleep deprivation. An honest person can hide information when the cost of disclosure becomes high. A generous person can become less generous when they feel threatened. A thoughtful person can make a careless decision under severe time pressure. This does not mean personality is imaginary. It means behavior is usually produced by an interaction, person times situation, not person alone. The danger of the character-only model is that it allows us to feel morally superior without asking a harder question. Would I behave differently under the same pressure, incentives, information, and constraints? Most people answer that question using an idealized version of themselves. But the honest answer is often, I do not know. Understanding context does not mean denying responsibility. Suppose someone insults you. Learning that they were stressed may explain the behavior. it does not make the insult acceptable. Suppose an employee repeatedly misses deadlines because they are overwhelmed. That context matters, but the work may still need to change, and accountability may still be necessary. Explanation and excuse are not the same thing. An explanation asks, what combination of person and situation produced this behavior? An excuse says, because there was a situation, the behavior should have no consequences. Those are different claims. You can hold someone accountable while still interpreting them accurately. In fact, accurate attribution usually produces better accountability. Instead of saying, you are careless, you can say, this is the third time the final review was skipped. What is causing that step to fail, and what needs to change? The first sentence attacks identity. The second identifies a pattern, investigates its cause, and preserves a clear standard. Context is not the opposite of responsibility. Context helps us decide what kind of responsibility is appropriate. The tendency to focus on personality is not identical in every society or situation. Research on attribution has long examined how cultural habits may influence whether people emphasize individual traits or surrounding relationships and social roles. People raised in strongly individual-centered environments may be especially encouraged to explain outcomes through personal choice, ability, and character. People raised in more interdependent environments may be more practiced at noticing roles, obligations, and social context. But this should not become another stereotype. No culture produces only one type of explanation. People move between dispositional and situational thinking depending on the event, their goals, their emotions, and how much information they have. The more useful lesson is not. People from one culture are biased, and people from another are not. It is, the explanations that feel natural to us are partly trained by the environments in which we learn to understand people. Even the way we explain behavior has a context. So how do you reduce the bias without becoming endlessly uncertain about everyone? Use a simple process called the Attribution Audit. It has 4 questions. Question 1. What did I actually observe? Separate behavior from interpretation. I sent 2 messages and received no reply is an observation. They do not respect me is an interpretation. The employee submitted the report 1 day late is an observation. They have no work ethic is an interpretation. Start with the camera recording, not the story. Question 2. What situational forces might I be missing? Do not search for one perfect excuse. Generate several plausible conditions. Were they under time pressure? Did they have the same information? Were they responding to incentives? Were they following someone else's instructions? Was the task more difficult than it appeared? You are not declaring any explanation true. You are preventing the first explanation from becoming the only explanation. Question 3. Does this behavior repeat across situations? One action offers weak evidence about a stable trait. A repeated pattern across different contexts offers stronger evidence. Someone who is late once may have encountered a problem. Someone who is late to work, social events, appointments, and flights, despite repeated attempts to address it, may have a stable pattern. Before assigning character, look for consistency. Question 4. How would I explain the same behavior if I had done it? This is the reversal test. If you interrupted someone, would you call yourself disrespectful, or would you mention urgency, excitement, or misunderstanding? If you forgot a task, would you call yourself uncaring, or would you explain how overloaded you were? Apply the same richness of context to other people that you automatically apply to yourself. The attribution audit prevents premature judgment, but sometimes you still need to make a decision. Should you trust this person? Hire them? Continue the relationship? Give them another opportunity? For decisions like these, use 3 lenses. Lens 1. The person. What stable tendencies have they shown over time? Do they accept responsibility? Do they learn from feedback? Do their actions match their stated values? Lens 2. The situation. What pressures, incentives, and constraints were present? Would many ordinary people behave similarly in that environment? Lens 3. The pattern. What happens when the situation changes? Does the behavior disappear when the pressure is removed? Does it continue across different settings? This third lens is essential. A single event cannot reliably separate personality from situation. Patterns across changing situations provide better evidence. Think of it like testing a plant. If one plant bends on a windy day, you cannot conclude that it has a weak stem. Watch what happens when the wind stops. If it remains bent in every environment, you have learned something more stable. Character is not revealed by one isolated frame. It is inferred from a sequence. Understanding this bias is also useful when other people misjudge you. You may explain your intentions repeatedly and still feel unseen. Your manager sees a missed deadline. You see an impossible workload. Your partner sees silence. You see an attempt to avoid saying something hurtful. Your friend sees distance. You see exhaustion. The temptation is to say, "You should know I am not that kind of person." But other people cannot directly observe your intentions or circumstances. They need evidence. Instead of defending your entire identity, make the hidden situation visible. Say, "I missed the deadline because the requirements changed twice. I should have communicated earlier. Here is how I will prevent the same problem next time." Or, "I became quiet because I was overwhelmed, not because I wanted to punish you. I understand that the effect still felt like rejection." Notice the balance. You explain the situation. You acknowledge the effect. You take responsibility for what can change. Good communication does not demand that others guess your context correctly. It helps them see it. For the next week, practice one habit. Whenever you catch yourself using a character label, pause. Lazy, rude, difficult, selfish, incompetent, unreliable. Then complete this sentence. One situation that could produce this behavior is, do not force yourself to believe the most charitable explanation. Simply generate one. This creates cognitive space between what happened and what you concluded. Then ask, what evidence would distinguish character from circumstance? Maybe you need another conversation. Maybe you need to observe a pattern. Maybe you need to set a boundary. Maybe the person really has behaved irresponsibly. Reducing bias does not mean replacing every negative judgment with a positive one. That would be another distortion. The goal is not to think well of everyone. The goal is to think accurately about them. Every person you meet is standing inside a situation you cannot fully see. There are pressures behind them, histories beneath them, incentives around them, fears they may never mention. And none of this means that character does not matter. It means character is not the only actor on the stage. The fundamental attribution error makes the world appear simpler than it is. It turns moments into identities, mistakes into personalities, and behavior into verdicts. Emotional maturity begins when you learn to pause before completing another person's story. The next time someone disappoints you, do not immediately ask, "What kind of person does that?" Ask, "What combination of person and situation might produce that?" Then watch for the pattern. Keep your standards, protect your boundaries, but leave enough room for reality to be more complicated than your first explanation. Because the best version of you is not the version that never judges. It is the version that knows when a judgment has outrun the evidence. Think of someone you may have judged too quickly. What did they do? What character label did you give them? And what part of their situation might you have been unable to see? Share your example in the comments. In the next episode, we will explore self-serving bias, why success feels like evidence of our ability, while failure so often feels like the fault of the situation.